welcome to Taking Stock. It's about time I looked at suffering, what C.S. Lewis called the problem of pain. Now, no matter how rich we are in the West, nonetheless people as individuals, if not in large religious or ethnic groups, still suffer. Not always from the same things, and not always so innocently as those who suffer through poverty or preventable diseases in the so-called third world suffer innocently, but they suffer just the same. They suffer from a lack of direction, loneliness, despair and prejudice. People still suffer pain, still die pointless deaths, relationships still break down. And in my experience, if there's one thing that seems to prevent inquirers from going on to become fully committed to Christianity, it's the problem of suffering. Now, some people say that suffering purifies the soul, but most people in this day and age would more probably agree with Benjamin the donkey in George Orwell's Animal Farm, who said, "They say God gives us a tail to keep away flies, but I'd rather have no tail and no flies." I should imagine that if you laid all the books that have ever been written on the subject of suffering end to end, they'd stretch all the way round and across all four lanes of the M25. Very few of them, if we are bitingly honest, are very good at what they attempt. The only one that for me has ever shed any light on the subject, and I've read a few, is by Rabbi Harold Kushner, and is called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And no, you can't borrow my copy, because I bought and lent out that book at least 5 times and have never got it back. Kushner points out that the vast majority of books on suffering treat the subject as an academic exercise in defending God from the charge of callous indifference to the sufferings of his creation. Kushner uses the book of Job as his frame of reference and doesn't shrink from the observation that even that profound piece of early literature, probably the oldest story in the Bible, does not manage really to resolve the conundrum of a God of goodness who nonetheless fails or refuses to prevent suffering when he could. The story of Jesus, to which for obvious reasons the rabbi doesn't refer, is often used by Christians as such a defence, because Christians point out that while God does not prevent Jesus from suffering on the cross, God suffers with us in Jesus, and he vindicates that suffering by the triumph of the resurrection. Well, I may well believe that to be true, and to preach the vindication of love and the triumph of good over evil which the resurrection represents. I have to say, though, that in all my ministry, that has rarely cut any ice with, for example, the parents of a child killed in a tragic accident, or the daughter who's had to watch her father go through the dreadful pain of terminal cancer. Apart from anything else, as someone once remarked, the fact that someone else is suffering doesn't make it any easier to bear this suffering of mine. I'd rather no one had to suffer. I sometimes feel I've heard too many arguments on the subject of why suffering. I've heard earnest evangelicals trying to lay the blame entirely at the door of you-know-who down below, or to the presence of sin, or both, and which of course requires the poor sufferer in some way always to be responsible for their own suffering, either by being sinful or by letting the devil have dominion over them. If there was even a faint chance that any of that rubbish was true, I'd say, oh yeah, so who created the devil then, and who gave us a capacity to be sinful? I've heard laid-back liberals, safe within their habitat-clad middle-class walls, and yet anxious to defend their divinity. I've heard them describe some people as having made lifestyle choices through the exercise of free will, which inevitably led to suffering. It made me want to take them into some of the council flats I've been in and show them the benefit statements which give the poor such a wide choice of lifestyle. When I really thought about this particular chapter of this series called Taking Stock, it was going to be about courage and constancy, but it turned into a discussion internally about the nature of suffering. Maybe that's how it should be, because I've seen so much suffering born with courage and seen so much suffering made so much worse by its absence. But without being maudlin or attempting to curry sympathy, I've had my own share of suffering in my life, and is a fortunate person who can reach my age and not say the same. And I've never been able to explain it all. I know why both my parents died at relatively early ages, and Sir Walter Raleigh is going to feel the rough edge of my tongue if ever we get to meet in paradise. I can't explain, though, at least theologically, why it should be that the first child of someone else very close to me, who could not possibly have done anything wrong and whose mother did everything right during her pregnancy, should die on the operating table at 3 days old from a congenital heart defect. I get so angry with people who try to explain it away, who try and defend God by inventing some dreadful, supposedly theologically sound spiritual balancing scale to explain away suffering, both in general and in particular. The intellectual arguments that paint God into a corner and then, like one of those awful pot boilers by Agatha Christie, make some twist which allow God to behave like the juvenile lead at the beginning of the next reel of those old black and white movies we used to get out of the Sunday morning pictures. You know, with one leap, our hero bounded free. They all make me sick, quite frankly. How dare they try to explain suffering away in such a facile manner? I can remember having to conduct the funeral service of a baby girl in the East End of London who was stillborn. I had to carry that tiny white coffin from the back of the hearse to the common grave she was laid in. As a stillbirth, she was not allowed to be buried in an ordinary grave. And I had to do that so that I could cover the nameplate with my stole, because I didn't want the father, who was originally going to carry it, to see that the engraver had got her first name wrong. It would have been a final blow to that young couple, whose empty, devastated looks I could see. I wanted to shout and scream at God, not defend him by trying to explain away the suffering of that family with some theologically precise and elegant statement. It's one of the crosses modern Christianity has to bear, that over the centuries we've allowed ourselves to be drawn into the centres of power. And one of the effects of that has been that the church has not been able to allow itself ever to say that it could ever be wrong. So we end up in the ridiculous situation where the elected head of the largest church in the world can be said to be, in certain circumstances, infallible. Well, what tosh. We're all fallible human beings, whatever our temporal prominence or power. Another of our crosses is the idea that, for some reason, the church should have an answer for every question ever raised in secular society. So there's always some loudmouthed cleric, usually Anglican, it must be said, who's wheeled out for a renter quote on any subject, from the death of the Princess of Wales to the World Trade Centre disaster, or even whether Manchester United should have played in a World Club Championship or the FA Cup in the year 2000. I don't see anything in the Bible which indicates that any human being needs to be an apologist for God. And nor do I see any reason why a believer should be expected to have all the answers to every question. Sometimes the honest and the right thing to say in answer to the question, why, like when you are standing in a rainy cemetery next to a couple who've just buried their child, is, I don't know either. There's nothing worse than to be exposed to the ramblings of a closed mind which tries to fit your daughter's death into the great scheme of things like the last piece in some diabolical jigsaw. Usually when that happens, it looks as though the last piece comes from a different jigsaw entirely. And if pressed, perhaps the only thing we can say is that we believe. We may not know why something happens, but we know who's in there with us, because we have the evidence of Jesus to show God's love for all of us, not just for those who can fit everything into their scheme or are determined to fit every piece into the puzzle, even if it means cutting the last piece in two to achieve their objective. There's a song I heard long ago on a hot summer afternoon in a pub garden in Finchingfield, Essex. I was part of a Morris dancing side which was touring with old Spot Morris men from Gloucester, and during an unofficial sing-around, the squire of old Spot Morris piped up with a song I'd never heard before and I've never heard since. And I only remember a fragment of it. In fact, if anyone can tell me what it's called and give me the rest of the song, I'd be very grateful after nearly 50 years of wondering. But it goes like this. We'll understand it better in the sweet by and by. All will be one, all will be one. We won't have to worry and we won't have to cry. Over in the old golden land. In the golden book of the golden game, the golden angel wrote my name. When the day goes down, I'll put on my crown. Over in the old golden land. It's always haunted me because at some deep level it resonates with the deep truth of our entire existence and it radiates hope, even in the face of suffering. I don't know what the overall scheme is, and whatever the theologians tell you, neither do they. I'm deeply suspicious of anyone who thinks, or at least acts as if they think, that they have all the answers. In my view, that's nothing less than intellectual arrogance and rank hypocrisy. Now, it might come over as heresy to say this, and I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, but nobody has yet convinced me that creation is quite finished yet, or if finished, quite perfected. I say this because life, however we try and live it, has its rough edges. And I know that only God has the power in my life to smooth over those rough edges. I only know that God loves me. And if I can hang on to that love, then even in the face of suffering, I can become a more rounded, fuller individual. In the power of God's love, it's possible to live and believe and even to suffer. And through that living and believing, and yes, even the suffering too, it's possible to grow. Stay safe, people.